Welcome to the And She Looked Up Creative Hour podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Hartfield, and I'm an artist and an entrepreneur. And yes, those two things can go together. This podcast is for the artists, the creatives, and the makers who want to find a way to make a living doing what they love. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 25 of the podcast. I'm your host, Melissa, and this is our first episode for September, and that means that I have a new guest host this month. I am super excited to welcome Ayngelina Brogan to the podcast. Hello, Ayngelina.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited to have you here.
Me too.
So, for those of you who may not be familiar with Ayngelina, she is the publisher behind the culinary travel website Bacon is Magic. And when she is in a normal year, which this year is anything but, she would be traveling around the world and splitting her time between Cuba and her home just outside of Halifax, Nova Scotia. But this is anything but a normal year, so she is currently at home in Nova Scotia. And we're going to be talking a little bit over the coming weeks about how she has had to pivot, like so many other people have had to do over the last few months. But today, we are going to be getting to know her a little bit better from a creative Canadian standpoint.
From a standpoint from someone who thinks they're not very creative.
See, that's what everyone says when you say things like that, but I don't buy that. I don't buy that whole philosophy that people don't think they're creative. But that was actually going to be my first question for you is, did you identify as a creative as a kid? And I'm going to guess that the answer is no.
No. And it's funny because I have kept a journal since I was 5. Basically, since I learned how to write, I had a journal of some sort. Maybe not 5, maybe a little bit older, but I think definitely in one of my closets here, I have a journal from when I'm 10 and a half. So writing was always something that has been part of my life. Although I guess I didn't really think of that as being creative. And because I've never written nonfiction. I've never written fiction. I've always written nonfiction. So I've always been someone who has kept a journal, and I have boxes and boxes of them. But expressing myself in a fictional way is not something that I've done. So I've never really considered myself a creative person at all. And then later on in life, I went and I worked at an advertising agency where there is a very clear division of the creative department and the account department. And I was in the account department, so I was considered a suit. And so that probably also, impacted how I feel about creativity and my lack thereof.
I'm just laughing because you're anything but a suit. That's pretty funny. So then tell us a little bit about, because I know you spent the first part of your career in PR and communications, like a lot of successful digital publishers do. A lot of you start out in that realm. What drew you to that in the first place when you decided to carry on to university?
Sure. So I would say I ended up in my first career quite late. I was initially enrolled at Dalhousie for a Bachelor of Science because I thought I might want to be a physiotherapist, which is so crazy. And then I met someone who did public relations for Acadia University, and I thought, wow, is that a job? Those are all of the skills that I had been using in high school, and no one had said to me, this could be a good option for you. And unfortunately, in high school, business was not something that was really focused on. If you were a bright kid, you were pushed into science, and that was the case. And thankfully, I met someone that summer, and Dalhousie said to me, you can switch from science to business. So I did a year there, and then moved on to Mount St. Vincent University for their public relations program. And that was a very challenging time because most of the people who enroll in this program already have a first degree or some sort of education. And so I would say that I was young and with surrounded by an ambitious group of people, but it was great. It was, I think, any background in communications and writing really helps. And I worked in public relations for a year, and that's a really tough gig. You know, I, it's, I really feel for people who work at public relations agencies because they're constantly justifying their existence. And certainly I worked on the client side within the marketing department, and I looked over at the marketing department and said, wow, they have more money. I want to be part of that. I don't want to be, fighting for money because I'm, justifying column inches and trying to explain, brand reputation. So when I moved to Toronto in 2001, I worked for an ad agency. And the reason I just happened to get that position was in university, I had an internship at a computer graphics company. And this agency in Toronto, their client was a competitor. And so I knew the background of a very specific niche. And I worked in advertising for 10 years and I loved it. I absolutely consider myself an agency person. More so an agency person than a client person. I loved working within the agency and all of the creative people. So I guess I admired people who were creative. Um, Yet I guess not understanding what I also brought to the table. And I thought that would be, my job for forever. I really thrived within advertising agencies and was doing very well at it and rose in my career quite quickly. And, what really changed it was turning 30 and wondering how many years I had left before I had to have children and like this part of my life would be over. And I had always loved to travel. I, took as much time as I could to travel and negotiated more vacation time in my career over payment, over salary.
Right.
And so I thought, I really want one last adventure, like one grand adventure to take a year or two off and just see the world before my life ends having children. I know it seems so crazy, but also the other thing was, I was very successful in my career, but I really, looking back, I describe it as being 95% happy, 95% fulfilled. And for so many people, that's enough. To be 95% is happier than most people. But for me, I only felt the 5% that was missing. And I could not understand why everyone else was so content and why I felt like I was still searching for something or I was just unfulfilled. I mean, I was making, to be honest, more money than I needed and had a job where I was appreciated and, had great friends and, all of these things that tick the boxes that people think that once they get that, they've made it, they're there. And I was there thinking, okay, but what else is there? This can't just be it. And so I was in a long-term relationship at that point that was really on again, off again, but we both loved travel. And I really tried to convince him to come with me because I didn't want to take a career break for a year or two on my own. I mean, the idea of traveling solo for so many people is terrifying, and it was terrifying for me as well. But he didn't want to go, and I could not convince him. I worked on it for months, and I thought, I really am scared to travel alone, but I'm more afraid of not going. I'm more afraid on missing out on this opportunity and looking back with regret. I mean, for me, I think regret is probably the most terrifying thing in my life. I've made a lot of mistakes. The mistakes you get over, but having the regret of not doing something was just something I couldn't get over. So I finally decided to do it. And I was very lucky in that the agency that I worked for said to me, we can't hold your job for a year or two because you don't know when you're coming back, but you're more than welcome when you come back. Let us know, we would love to have you. And I didn't really ever go back. So it was great. I never thought I would be someone that would work for myself because I loved working at the agency, and I liked, well, I thought that I liked not having that risk of never knowing where your income comes from. And so entrepreneurship, I never thought would be something that I would do. And that was back in 2010 when blogging was a hobby at best, not considered legitimate. Most people were still on Blogger. I don't know how I ended up on WordPress, but I started my site just really as a portfolio that when I returned, it would be something that I could share with people. This is what I've been doing for the last 10 years, or 2 years. It hasn't been that, I've just been off gallivanting and doing nothing with my time. So it was very interesting to see how the landscape changed. And I think because I worked in media and marketing, I was able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, it's interesting how many really successful bloggers there are out there who got their start in a very similar way to you. But I just thought it was interesting what you said, that you were like 95% happy, but you could only focus on the 5% not happy. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who are probably hearing this and nodding and have never really wanted to admit that. I think there's an awful lot of people who are checking all those boxes, and they realize, I've done this, I've done all the things I'm supposed to do, and things are pretty good, but there's something that's missing. Like there's just something, there's got to be a little bit more. I totally relate to what you were saying there.
I think a lot of women in their early 30s begin to feel this because they spend most of their 20s being very driven. And then the expectation is then to move on to children. And some do, some don't. And then that sense of, am I the happiest I can be, may grow stronger as you get older. And it's also harder to combat because we are, creatures of comfort, and to have change is very difficult. And certainly we've seen that this year with
absolutely.
How people are dealing with the pandemic. And so change is terrifying. And my site, I think, at least in the first couple of years, part of the reason why people read, back then it was just, here's what I did today. But I think a lot of people identified with my personal struggle, one, of not knowing what I wanted to do with my life when I could do anything. And then also not knowing if I wanted to have children. And I really tapped into that, I would say, around year one of writing. I was in Colombia, and I just, I was so fortunate to be able to travel, and yet I was miserable, and I felt really guilty for being miserable. And so I wrote about how sometimes traveling isn't fun. It's not this big adventure, and sometimes it's a hassle. And, back in 2010, people didn't have smartphones. I didn't have any phone. I got lost a lot. I didn't understand a lot of things. There were many times I was sitting basically on a curb somewhere crying, frustrated because I didn't know what was going on. And so I wrote about that. And then the next month I wrote a post in response to people who were emailing me every week and sometimes every day saying that I was so brave. And so that post was called The Year I Walked Away from Love. And it was about being in this relationship and leaving it to travel, and all of the conflict that I felt, and that I cried a lot. I cried a lot on buses in Mexico. I cried through Central America. It was a very cathartic time of just kind of letting everything out. And then also at the same time, I was hoping that travel would give me this light bulb moment where all of a sudden it would be, aha, this is what you're supposed to do with your life. And then I realized that was never going to come. So life is like, I think, a slow dimmer. If you really follow what you want to do in your passion and your gut, things slowly become more illuminating. But it's never just this light switch where you say, this is your path in life. And I think that's because it changes. It isn't perhaps one constant path, but many roads and side streets that you go down, and once you become comfortable with that, things get a lot easier.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I totally agree with that. That's such a good way of putting it. And it is like sometimes getting lost in a town that's unfamiliar to you. You walk down the wrong road and it's a dead end, and so you turn around and go out, or you walk down a road and you find something really cool that you never would have even thought to look for. So I think that's a really good way to kind of frame it.
Hmm.
So you left your job in Toronto. You headed out to, I think Mexico was your first destination, was it? Was that?
I bought a one-way ticket to Mexico, and I landed there, and I did not speak any Spanish. Fortunately, my backpack did not arrive. So, and I bought a ticket to Cancun because that was the cheapest flight from Toronto. And what I didn't realize was that I had arrived during spring break,
Oh,
the the antithesis of the type of person I am. And so I land in Cancun during spring break. I'm not on an all-inclusive. I don't have my bag, and I don't know how to explain to anyone in the airport that I don't have my bag. But I figured it out. No one spoke English, but I was like just pointing like there's no bag. And so they gave me a form and everything worked out. Um, and that's where it started. So the plan originally was to travel my first year overland from Mexico to Argentina, and then take a flight to South Africa, and then to travel overland up through Africa and then through the Istan countries, and then end in Mongolia. And that would be, my big grand adventure. And I didn't make it out of Latin America. It just, I really had to learn not to be so focused on what I should do or what I said I was going to do, and just to be in the moment. And I really fell in love with Latin America. And I feel like many countries gave me gifts of understanding myself more, because as I was learning Spanish and learning how to express myself in Spanish, I was also learning about who I was when there weren't other people around there to define me, and they didn't have any expectations of me. And I think that is really the greatest gift travel gives you, because no one expects anything of you because they don't know you. And so sometimes maybe people feel like they have this prison of expectations from friends and family in very well-meaning ways. But when you're around people that don't know you, you can be whoever you want to be.
and who did you find out you were? Like, were you surprised by who Angelina was when there was nobody around to worry about impressing?
I think people, when I returned back after I first came home after a year and a half, and I think people would say that I was more open with my emotions, perhaps a bit more warm. I've always been a very driven, and I would say assertive, sometimes on the verge of aggressive person. And so I think I learned to lighten up a little bit. And then part of that is in many cultures in Latin America, especially Mexico, people express how they feel. They're not afraid to express if they're happy or they're sad or they're angry. And so you always kind of know where you stand with most people. Not everyone, of course, but with a lot of people, you know where you stand. And I think before I left, I was guarded with my emotions no matter what they were, especially being vulnerable. But, I'm serious that I cried on so many buses in Mexico. I think in Canada, people would think you're crazy, or they would come over and try to help you, but there, people just left me alone. And not in a bad way, but just left me in my feelings. And so I guess I learned to explore my feelings a lot more, because I had no fear of judgment. because people just took it at face value. And I still find that with a lot of in different countries, and certainly in Cuba as well. If someone is mad at you, you really know it. There's not the same kind of passive aggressive, I'm not going to call you for a week. They'll tell you you did something wrong and here's what it is. Now, you may or may not agree with them, but at least you know what they're thinking.
Oh, that sounds so nice to me.
I know.
How much time do we spend second guessing what other people are thinking and feeling? Would just be,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you spent a year and a half out on the road, and by the sounds of it, it sounds like parts of it were pretty miserable for you. And so when you came home at the end of the year and a half, did you know you were going to go back out there, or did you really think you were going to head back to work?
No, I knew I was just coming back for a little bit. At the 1 year mark, I realized, so in 2010, blogging was really a hobby for people. And there was a very small, compared to now, community of travel bloggers. And we had this network of people all around the world. And we were really connected by feeling like we were all doing something very different. And we communicated a lot through email or Facebook because no one else really understood what we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So around, I would say, when I wrote The Year I Walked Away from Love, I had also committed to seeing where this went and really exploring an unconventional life. And at that point, I was in South America, and I still had savings left. And so I thought, maybe I can make this work, and maybe I can write on other people's sites, or, find work in different ways that I can keep this going. Because at that time I was basically living on $1,000 a month, sometimes less. I rented an apartment or a house. I rented a full house in the Galapagos for $400 a month. Wow. So you can really live on very little, as long as you have internet. The Galapagos, the internet was not very good, so eventually I had to leave that. But I knew that I did not want to go back to my old lifestyle, that I had changed, and maybe also identified that there were opportunities in blogging. And I recognized that because I came from a marketing background, and I worked with agencies and with clients. And so I felt that there was some value that I could provide. And so in the beginning, I was taking press trips around the world. Jordan was the first country to invite me somewhere, and people were interested in working with me to write about their countries and my experience there. And at that time, it was just, a trade of travel for work. And I loved it in the beginning because instead of, having to spend money on a trip to Jordan, I had a week-long trip there, going to the best places, staying in the best hotels. I had my own personal tour guide and driver, and it was fantastic.
That was going to be one of my questions, is how were you surviving financially? So you hinted there that you had some savings before you headed out. And you're right, like in those early days, there were some people who were earning money from blogging, but it wasn't much. And it really doesn't matter which niche you were in, whether it's travel, lifestyle, food. Most of it was an exchange. Like you were getting a trip in exchange for content, or you were getting free clothes in exchange for content, that kind of thing. So did you do any freelancing on the side as well? Or were you just pretty much living off savings and where people could send you, type of thing?
I was, at one point, I became the South America guide for About.com, and that paid me $900 a month. And so it basically paid my monthly expenses. Right. So at that point, I still had my savings, but I wasn't using them. And I was, other than taking these media trips, unless I went to Europe a couple times, but to backpack around anywhere, or even to rent an apartment in South America, was not that expensive. So I was kind of maintaining my lifestyle as it was. And as time passed, I realized there was more opportunity to work with brands and destinations for money. Because the reality is that a free trip is never free. Free clothing is never really free. There's always something expected of you. And so it did not take long before I didn't really want to do the free trips anymore. It was exhausting and it was just nonstop work. I mean, some media trips that I've been on, you begin at 6 a.m. and you don't get back until midnight. And so the travel aspect of it is really tiring. Now, that really depends on the destination I work with now, because some places are great. I earlier last year I went to Ireland on a food trip and all we did was eat at high-end restaurants the whole time and there were only three of us. It was like a vacation with two new friends. That was great. But a lot of places are not like eating in, Michelin star restaurants in Ireland. And so every once in a while I will do one of them if I have some passion for it, but I really needed to think about how do I take this as from this is a personal blog and I'm a blogger to this is a business that will survive long term. And that was a huge turning point for me. And so I stopped doing free trips and I started looking at like, what is the actual business of Bacon is Magic going to be?
Yeah, that's a big turning point for a lot of bloggers. And what were you thinking? Like, how did you address that? I would also imagine that there does come a point where being on the road constantly can start to wear on you a little bit. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you need to feel like there's more to it than just getting a free destination kind of thing. Like, you do need to have some future planning in place.
You and travel burnout is a real thing. I mean, the first time I burned out, I was in Sevilla in Spain, and I just didn't want to get out of bed. There were new things to see, and I just didn't want to see any of it. I just didn't appreciate anything. It was just like, oh, there's just going to be like another church and a museum, and there are going to be pretty streets, and I. It feels horrible to say that because I have been so fortunate, but I recognized that the day that that happened to me that I needed to change how I was doing things. So the idea of backpacking long term, for 10 years, to be honest, when I look at a lot of the travel bloggers that started with me in 2010, maybe 5 or 10% of them are still around. And almost every single person has a base. I don't know anyone who doesn't have some sort of either splitting time or holds an apartment somewhere, because on the flip side of traveling and being around people who don't define you, you can lose yourself if you don't have connections with people. And so if your website and people online are your only formal relationships, you could really lose yourself. And I
Yeah.
think that does happen to people.
When I look back at the people who started around 2010, which is around the time that I started as well, and see who's still around today, the landscape is so different. And I feel like the people who are still doing it today are the ones who they're just masters of endurance. I think that's what it really comes down to. There are days where it is a slog and a grind, and I think people don't realize that. It sounds very glamorous when you hear about what people do. Oh, you travel the world and you get to see all these amazing exotic things, and it sounds amazing. But the truth is, there's an awful lot of hard work that goes into that, and I don't think people necessarily realize that until they start doing it themselves.
And I will say that we, as a community, travel publishers are horrible at perpetuating this myth. So we post pictures of ourselves on a laptop at the beach, and everyone knows you cannot see a screen. You cannot see your laptop screen. So we want to like share, like, look at our life. Like, I'm off in some exotic tropical country working at the beach only 4 hours a week. That's not true. I mean, most of us have periods of time that we are working basically until our eyes dry out every day, like locked up in some hotel room or somewhere that has good Wi-Fi, and we're just working away. but we don't show that. And so I think that's to our detriment, because then people don't respect what they do. And I would say the same thing for Instagrammers who are into fashion and travel and lifestyle. They get a lot of flack, but I have seen some of these people behind the scenes, and they do a tremendous amount of work and have skill that we don't have. But because it's just, this shot that looks so easy to do, most people just think, they don't deserve the accolades that they receive for it, and they don't actually have skills. And I try to appreciate people in newer media like Instagram and TikTok and Vine and all of those things, because I know it is much harder than even I think it is, because now I'm like the old school senior citizen of content creators.
Yes, exactly. So at this point, as you were starting to look towards finding more paid work, how were you going about it? Were people coming to you, or were you at this point starting to pitch? Because I'm imagining, coming from an ad agency and with a PR background, pitching is something that you were probably pretty comfortable doing and you knew how to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And so at one point I decided I would go back to Toronto, and I found a cheap apartment, and that would be my base. So if I was traveling, I could still pay my rent and everything would be fine. But at the same time, because I had a base in Toronto, I started to meet with PR agencies and um, made a lot of introductions, just with agencies to say, here's who I am and here's how I work. Because at that time, this would have been 2013, 2014, the idea of working with bloggers, and I don't think Instagram was out yet, um, was very interesting and appealing, and clients were starting to ask for it, but they thought we would still work for free. So I met with a lot of people just to say, this is some of the work that I've been doing with other people, and just say to them, don't be afraid to ask me of what I will and I won't do. And that very much happens, where no one wants to set expectations, or they want to set too many expectations. And so it was always just great to kind of meet with someone for coffee and say, here's how I've worked with other brands. These are things I've created for them. Here's how I would like to work in the future. And, for example, if you have a campaign coming up and you have a budget, you feel free to call me if you think you want to work with me. And I'm happy to kind of have a brainstorming or give you some ideas of things that I could do with this brand and some of the pricing that would go along with it. Instead of coming to me and saying, I have $200 and I want 10 Instagram posts, because that's not going to happen. But you've already pitched that to the client and they've signed off on it. But now you can't secure that with me, because that's not how I work. But definitely working at an agency and understanding that a lot of times you get junior people because maybe the client doesn't have a big budget, and so they can't afford to have an account director doing all of the legwork. They need someone more junior. A lot of times they're just the messenger, and so to try to have patience, and then also to educate them as well, because at some point the most junior person at the agency is could be the president at another agency. So it was really about like, let's grow in this industry together, because you need us and we need you.
That's something, when I first met you, which I don't remember when that was. It was probably 2014, 2015, somewhere in there. But I was kind of in awe of you, because you were charging rates that I don't think very many people had the guts to charge, and you were getting them. You were getting paid. And I just remember thinking, wow, and I knew you weren't like a million monthly page view site at that point. And yet you were getting paid well and for the time. And I just was like, wow, I was kind of blown away by how confident. I think that's what it was that struck me about you, is you were so confident in what you could deliver. You knew you were delivering value, and you weren't willing to let somebody tell you otherwise. And you really stood your ground, which not a lot of people in the content creation industry are very comfortable doing. I think more people are now, but definitely around that time, that took a lot of guts.
Oh, I know. I mean, my perspective was always I would rather do one project for $1,000 than 10 for $100 and over deliver on what I was doing. I also was very cognizant of not wanting to have too much branded content for readers. My readers were great in that they want me to do well and they want to see me succeed. And they also know that I'm very picky about who I work with and that I try to lead the storyline for the brand. So I may work with someone, but it's generally, I would say probably 90% of the time, it's my idea I have this great idea for some content, and this would be a good brand fit for them. And so on the positive side, I've never really had anyone say to me, you're selling out or you're doing too much brand work, because they are happy to see me succeed because they've been with me along this journey of, crying on buses in Mexico. So like, oh, it's great. I'm still crying, but maybe in a different way. So I have always been confident about what I charged because also I knew that while I didn't have the numbers that some people had, I knew my work was good, it was sincere, and that also I had a base of people that really did trust my recommendations. So I still feel that way. And, it's hard now because people want to see big numbers, but there's no way when you work with brands and destinations that only want numbers, there's no way to share with them the value that you have in trust and the value that you have in, every second Instagram post isn't a sponsored post. Mm-hmm. And that people really, they do buy from you and they do take your recommendations into consideration. And that struggle is the same struggle that PR agencies have, is that they are also trying to share with their clients that it's not always about numbers. It's about developing credibility and trust and all of those things. And so if someone wants to have 1 million views a month, which sadly I still do not have, they can go somewhere else. I have a very niche topic. I have an audience that is engaged. If I wanted 1 million views, I know that I would go after either I would be like a vegan raw food paleo blogger, and then I would have 1 million views. I know how to get it. I just don't want to do that. So, but really, yeah, my site is called Bacon is Magic, so I think it's too late to become a vegan.
But it was around this time too that you went down another street that you weren't probably expecting to go down, but you wound up owning part of a restaurant in downtown Toronto.
Yes. These were crazy years. So this was 2015 to 2017. I was having actually probably the most successful years on my site. I had developed a reputation within, I think, both food and travel in Canada, and people were coming to me with some really great partnerships. At that time, I had been working with Culinary pasta for 2 years. It was a great partnership. It's a Canadian brand. I was so happy to work with them, and they were fantastic. And at the same time as that, I started working with Pepto-Bismol over 2 years, which was the perfect brand partnership because I carry Pepto-Bismol with me everywhere. And so I had other smaller campaigns, but these campaigns over 2 years were great because they were brands that I loved and used and felt so good about sharing. And they were also longer term campaigns where, we could do some fun things. And Pepto-Bismol, I could pitch them ideas that were not already within, our contract. And they were really open to accepting and working with me on just things that I thought would just be a good fit for them. And on the flip side of that, when I was traveling, I met a chef in Prince Edward Island, and then he decided to move to Toronto with me and work. We ran a pop-up restaurant in the back of a dive bar for a year, and I helped him do that because they didn't have any servers that could run food. And then I basically ran a Kickstarter campaign where we became the first Kickstarted restaurant in Canada, and we opened up a restaurant on Queen Street West, which is crazy because I have never wanted to own a restaurant. I've never even wanted to be in a relationship with a chef. And a lot of people thought that, oh, this is like the last chapter of your fairy tale story. Like, you've made it. It's, a food blogger and a chef, and she can finally settle down and look at this. It's so great. And it was great. I learned a lot. I really appreciate his creativity. And as someone who writes about restaurants, I learned so much that I think has made me better at my job today, and to really have a full understanding of both the good and the bad of the hospitality industry and working with farmers and just things that as consumers and as diners that we never see. Mm-hmm. So it was a really great time. It was also, when it started to go south, a very difficult time because, as a chef, he had a very public Instagram life, and I had brought him onto my site. And we were very, I guess, public about our relationship in a way that maybe I wouldn't have been if I had been dating other people. And so when we decided to break up and then later sell the restaurant, it was hard to try to decide what was the right thing in communicating this. Like, do I need to announce this? Because that's a weird announcement.
Yes.
And we're broken up, the blog post. So I was silent probably, and I wasn't as active on my site for the last year because when things weren't going well, like, I just didn't even know how to tackle it. And so I didn't say anything at all. I figured if people knew me, they would know. And if people didn't know me other than, like, if the only way you have to contact me is through a DM, then maybe we're not close enough friends that I need to divulge this to you.
Right.
And so I did get a lot of DMs from people because in Toronto, I kind of played both roles. I was not only a Toronto food Instagrammer, but I also had a restaurant. And so a lot of that community I knew really well, and very sweet people, but that was my only connection to them. And so they would send me, messages saying, are you guys still together? And I just didn't answer them. And it was probably the first time in my life where I just kind of shut down. It did not communicate what was going on with my life, because I just didn't know what I would say. And to be honest, it also felt like, I think anytime a relationship ends, it feels a bit like a failure. And so to have to explain that in a public way when you're still processing your own feelings is really tough. And I've since written about it. And my approach to everything that I write about that's personal, because I have written many personal posts on my site, is that I like to come out of it and have perspective, and to be able to share that perspective with people so that they can maybe learn from it or find some value in it. Me writing that I'm crying because we broke up and I don't know, like, where did this go wrong kind of thing, doesn't help anybody. So I really did wait until I felt like I could share the good of it,
I read somewhere, and I can't remember exactly how the saying went, but that you shouldn't share while the wound is raw. You should wait until the scabs start to form. And I think that's true for so many things. It's just when your brain hasn't even processed it yet, it's very hard to share anything that's going to be useful to anyone else. Yes, I can appreciate that. But while you were running the restaurant, you cut back on your travel quite a bit. I don't remember if you did any traveling during that time. I think if you did, it was probably quite minimal.
So I at the time I was doing more food partnerships.
Right.
Um, so that's really where the opportunity, I mean, if we want to talk about kind of the finances in things, travel, like destinations don't have a lot of money. I've been fortunate to work with some destinations who've been generous, but working with a destination over a consumer brand, there's no contest in terms of budget. And that's just because the destination also has to cover all of your travel and accommodation and all of these things.
Right.
They're public entities, so they have a fixed budget versus being, a corporation that at times has a very generous budget. So I found that when we opened the restaurant, I was supposed to retire from it because we also did not want to work together, but also it was never my dream to open a restaurant. I had my own business, but the funny thing is when we told people who were couples that owned restaurants, they told me that wouldn't happen, that of course I would end up as part of the business. And I did. And that's because I have a business background. And so there were things going on, and I had worked in an office, and I was very well, and I fired people before. And so there were just a lot of things that I had to step in on and say, no, we need to do this properly. Because restaurants, to be honest, can be chaotic, and I'm surprised there aren't more lawsuits, and there probably aren't more lawsuits because they don't have any money, so people don't see them as worthy of suing. But there are a lot of really messed up things that happen, and I did not want to be associated with any of that. So I was kind of like that. We're going to do everything above the books kind of way. So, so I did take a step back, and it's tough when I look back at it. I do regret some of it because I put that part of my career on the back burner while supporting someone else's dream. But when I kind of look at the net, I did learn a lot. And so I don't regret doing it, but I would not recommend doing that. I've become a little bit more aware of, in that time, I guess, because I had my life prior to that had been so self-involved, I felt that it was a good idea to give more of myself, and that I could put my own dreams or my own business back on the back burner for a little bit, because so much of my life had been so self-involved beforehand. But I think that's important. In some ways that was a mistake, and maybe I could have had a better balance of that.
But you did start to get itchy feet. I mean, you did start to want to head back out. And once you were able to tie up all the loose ends with the restaurant and move on from that relationship, it sounds like we're just cutting a knife through it. It's like, okay, it's done. And I know that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
But you did head back out. And when you headed out for the next chapter, what was that like? Like, did it feel like you were literally starting fresh, or was it just a continuation of where you dropped off, or did you approach it differently?
Well, I think I went big. So I decided to go back to Mexico because that was my happy place, and also where I felt comfortable there. I knew, I knew the culture, things were familiar, and I wanted an adventure, and I wanted to do something that was just for me. And you know what? I probably cried on more buses in Mexico again, to be honest. Because, you can say you're done with a relationship, but you're not really done. Like, I don't know how long it takes to get over something, but I was, it took me longer than necessary because I was really burned by the whole thing. And so I wanted to have a great adventure. And then I also took on new opportunities that maybe I wouldn't have taken before, because I just thought, let's see where this goes. Like, let's see where things, are going to go with my life now that I can do anything. It's back to just me. And what do I want to do? And so I went to Mexico. And then while I was there, new opportunities came up. And uh, I was with friends and we decided to go to Cuba for a long weekend. And despite having traveled all over Latin America, Cuba for me was really intimidating because I don't really know very much about it. And so it seems like, oh, it's this like communist wall and there are restaurants there, but they're in people's houses. And how do you find where to eat? And do they have Wi-Fi? And so we decided to go for 4 days. And I now feel so foolish about this because I went to Havana and it is a major city, like every other major city in the world. And yes, back in the 90s when they opened up, only restaurants were really in hotels or in people's homes. But now there are restaurants everywhere, like normal restaurants. And it just means they're not state owned, they're private restaurants. And, but at the same time, it was challenging to find how to get off the tourist track. And our second to last day, we just ran into some locals, and one of them had shared one of my friends had shared that I was there to write about food and I hadn't had hadn't had good food. And that's the truth. And we just kept going to all the wrong places. And I was so frustrated. I'd almost given up on Cuba. And they said to us, well, why don't you come with us? Come with us. We're going to go for lunch to a very local spot. And so we went to lunch and we bought a bottle of rum and had some beer and, ate all afternoon. And the bill was $17 for 5 of us. And I thought it was like this, well, at this point, it was a light bulb. It was a little light bulb that went off and thought, this is what I'm supposed to do. Because if I can't find, the real places to go in Havana, then no one can. Not no one, but really no one. So I asked them, I said, if I come back and rent an apartment for a month, do you think you could help me with other places that are like these? And that was over 2 years ago. I just kept going back. There was just so much more to learn. And again, the culture, the nuances in the culture, I'm just so attracted to. And it is a new chapter in my life. And I enjoy learning and sharing about Cuba and its culture. And what's great about it is because it's in the Caribbean, it's quite easy for me to travel other places too. So basically I'm splitting. If I'm not traveling for work, then I'm in Cuba. And then I also come back home to Nova Scotia to see my family because I have 2 new nephews. And of course I want to see my family.
And I know you're home right now. And I think this is one of the things I think this is probably what we're going to talk about next week, but you're not in Cuba this year. Well, I think you started the year in Cuba, but
I had to leave when Trudeau said they were going to close the border. I thought, well, maybe I should just come back, but not having realized that it would turn out like this.
Yeah, I don't think anybody expected 2020 to turn out the way it has turned out, and I know that for you and for many other travel writers and anybody who's involved in the travel industry, this has been quite the shock to the system. And you've definitely had to figure out how to pivot this year, as have many other people. And I think that's probably what we'll talk about next week is how do you pivot when life throws a massive curveball at you. But are you looking to go back? Like, when things turn, if they go back to normal? I really don't know when that's going to happen or if that will happen. But is that where you're looking to go back to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're going back to normal at all. No. Things will be different. So, but also because my life in the last 10 years has been so unconventional, I think that I've been able to deal with the stress of not knowing and things not being normal.
Yeah.
And when I came home, I saw it as a gift of time, and I still consider it a gift of time. And I had hoped it would be November, but now I don't know. It could be, it could be sometime next year. But at the same time, I'm thinking, okay, so now what does this mean for the business? And, what can I do with this time that perhaps I couldn't do in Cuba? Because as you know, to be a digital content creator in Cuba is not easy. The Wi-Fi is expensive and it's not always reliable. So I've had to shift how I work there. And I don't know. We'll just see how it goes. We're just going to, that's what life is about, really. It's not about wondering, spending all your time wondering and worrying. It's just about waiting until it arrives and dealing with it as it comes.
Yes, you're so right. I think that's one thing that entrepreneurs have been lucky with during this whole thing. I think that most of us who work for ourselves or who run our own business or multiple businesses, we are much more adept at managing change because that's just our lives. And it's been interesting to watch a lot of people over the last few months just really struggling to accept that the change is here. I think a lot of people are still kind of in denial about it and just really, really hoping that things are going to return to normal. And I think at some point you have to just step back and accept that, no, this is normal now. Like this is what normal is now. And I need to figure out how to make my life work with that. And that's hard. That's hard for a lot of people. You know, change is not, humans are not good with change for the most part. There's a few exceptions, and I think entrepreneurs fit into that exception category. I think we kind of really do not crave change necessarily, but we like change to a certain extent. So
I think we expect it.
Yes, you know, that's a better way to put it.
Doing this for 10 years, we've had discussions about, you know, constantly evolving your skills and exploring new media, and how is your brand expressed on other platforms that are not your own, and taking the time to experiment with things. So my website as it was in 2010 is very different than it is now, and the things that I write and share about, although they're still generally the same, they're expressed differently. And so I think we expect change, hope to capitalize on it if we can, but know that things are not going to stay the same. You know, it's not like a TV show that gets interrupted and then all of a sudden it's, you know, back to your regularly scheduled programming. That's not what life is, and that's certainly not what it's going to be when and if, you know, we are able to find a vaccine for coronavirus. It's going to be different from now on. It's interesting because children seem to be okay with it. Everyone worries about their kids, but kids seem to be the best at adapting to this because they don't have those same expectations.
Very true. Kids are far more resilient and adaptable than I think we give them credit for. And yeah, we could all take a page from their book.
Exactly.
So I think that's a great way to end. And I hope that everybody's enjoyed getting to know Ayngelina a little bit better. She has had quite the interesting life over the last 20 years. So she's going to be with me for the next 3 weeks in September, and we are going to be diving into some more business topics. One of the ones that, as I've mentioned, is we're going to talk a little bit about learning how to pivot, or how to figure out how to pivot, which I think is, whether your business has been affected by COVID-19 or not, there are always going to be things that come your way that you're going to have to figure out how to work around. And so maybe you have to pivot on a small scale or a big scale. But one of the things about being a small business owner is we have flexibility that a lot of bigger companies don't have. And so pivoting is something that we can do much more easily than others can. So that's a strength if you're a small business owner. And I don't know what else we're going to talk about. We had listed some ideas, but we will let you know what those are as we get closer to them. So thanks, Ayngelina, for being here this week. And I'm excited to have you back next week and for the rest of the month.
Me too. I can't wait.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this week, and we will see you next Friday. Thank you so much for joining us for the And She Looked Up Creative Hour. If you're looking for links or resources mentioned in this episode, you can find detailed show notes on our website at andshелookedup.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter for more business tips, profiles of inspiring Canadian creative women, and so much more. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the show via your podcast app of choice so you never miss an episode. We always love to hear from you, so we'd love it if you'd leave us a review through iTunes or Apple Podcasts. drop us a note via our website at andshelookedup.com or come say hi on Instagram at andshelookedup. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.